Hello everyone, my name is Rik Van Bruggen from Neo4j, and here I am recording another podcast episode. And I think the other person on the other side of this call is going to agree that it's been way too long.
It has been way too long.
Hello Emil, it's been such a long time since we've done a podcast together.
It has, and we all know who to blame for that.
It's me, I know. Sorry. I apologize. But thank you for coming back. It's the end of 2018. Christmas is upon us. So it feels like it's a good time to kind of review and see where we are. And,
is this your Christmas gift to me, that you finally invite me back?
Yes, it is. So Emil, so many things to talk about, obviously, right? But our dear friend Luke Gannon from the Neo4j professional services team sent me this really interesting tweeted idea from a guy called David Perel on things to talk about on a corporate podcast. And that's what was more for an internal podcast, but I think we can do our own version of that. Is that okay for you?
Sounds awesome.
Sounds great. So the first thing I'd love to have a chat with you about is, a little bit of a, historical view, where did we come from, but also, vision, what do you think about that we need to be doing with Neo4j, and what's your, more long-term oriented idea of, what we contribute to the industry?
I guess there's two parts of that. One is kind of history, looking backwards. The other one is kind of vision and future, looking forwards, right?
Yes.
So let me, I guess, start chronologically then. Basically, I've been doing this for all my professional life in one way or shape or form. I grew up as a hacker. I really got my probably, quasi-professional feet wet, if you will, in the early parts of the internet, doing online role-playing games, like text-based role-playing games. So the equivalent of World of Warcraft or something like that. I'm sure there's way more modern and updated versions of that, but like online fantasy-based games, right? But they were text-based. This is in the early 90s. I was a teenager at the time. But really started running these. They were called MUDs at the time, and started doing them. And at one point, was involved, co-founded one of the more popular ones on the internet. At peak, it had like 100 players at the same time, or something like that. Which was, hey, that was a significant fraction of the internet in the early 90s, right?
Of course, yeah.
And then fast forward a couple of years, and I was working as a professional programmer in the late 90s, early 2000s, at an enterprise content management startup based in Sweden. I rapidly grew to become the CTO and found that half of my team, we were about probably 20 engineers, something like that, and half of them spent the majority of their time fighting against the database. And we used like the classic stack that people used at the time, which was a relational database, a business layer in an application server, and then a presentation, web front type presentation layer, right? And in all my previous projects, the database had been a help. It had been an accelerator, right? But for some reason, it was really slowing us down. And that reason we now know, like I think as an industry, we have a language for it and a much crisper understanding, but it took us a while to figure it out. But in a nutshell, it was that there was this mismatch between the shape of the data that we worked with and the abstractions that were exposed, the building blocks that were exposed by the relational database. So we're doing content management, so that's files that belong to folders and folders that belong to those folders, which is a big kind of connected thing. And then we had this big security hierarchy where we have Rik, and Rik belongs to, let's say, product marketing, which is a group. That group in turn belongs to both the marketing group and the product management group. And then you have to connect that security kind of hierarchical, but actually more than hierarchical structure with the content structure, which is also hierarchical or even more than that. And that just becomes a big mess of connected data. And we took all that, which is rapidly evolving. You have to resolve these permissions very rapidly, and just store that in tables. And that worked. It is mathematically proven that you can store anything in a relational database, right? So it worked, but it's just very painful. It took a long time, like just, purely from a developer productivity perspective. It was also really slow in a runtime perspective, just purely performance, because you ended up with a lot of joins, which we know are one of the most, if not the most powerful mechanism you have in a relational database, but also really, really expensive to do. So that was kind of the birth of it. We looked at that and saw that, weird. Like, why do only we have this problem? There must be other domains where there's so much connected data. And then we kind of thought a little bit, it's like, okay, so probably other people have it today. What about tomorrow? Do we believe that there's going to be more or less connectivity in the world, like going forward, right? And ultimately, I guess, data models the real world. As the real world is becoming more and more connected, data will become more and more connected. And connected data, exerts this pressure, this tension on the relational database paradigm. Like, as every day goes on, that pressure will just be stronger and stronger. And back in the early 2000s, we couldn't say that, hey, exactly this particular date, it's going to break for most applications. But we did feel like, we're on the right side of history here. Like, over time, there's just going to be more and more applications where there's going to be so much connected data. There's going to be so much value in querying across relationships, across connections, that people will start to move away from the relational database and not abandon it, but they will augment it, put the connected data somewhere else.
And did that already make you feel like, you were going to be able to answer like different questions because of that? Or was it more of a speed thing that you were looking for at the time? Or what was it? What was the main driver there?
Yeah, it was more the latter. It was more that we saw this pain that we experienced already, not to do novel things, but just to do basic things, right? We wanted to do basic things that just involved a lot of connections, right? And we felt that, hey, if we perceive, X amount of pain today, there's going to be more people with that level of pain, X, right? But also in this particular domain, it's going to be even more connected. So we're going to do 10x pain tomorrow, right? For some definition of tomorrow. So we only thought about it, at least I only thought about it from that perspective. Now, of course, fast forward to today, we know that this has unlocked all kinds of new things that was just not previously possible.
All right, let's talk a little bit about that, because I've seen you on stage a bunch of times saying, Neo, we want to help the world make sense of data. Right?
Yes. That sounds familiar.
It does sound familiar. I don't know who wrote it. But what does that mean today? We talk about things like ICIJ, Panama Papers. We talk about NASA. But how do you think that making sense of data, how we should look at that today, and how that's going to evolve into the future?
Yeah, so maybe to back up a little bit for podcast listeners. So help the world to make sense of data is our mission statement, right? And it's fairly precise worded. It is help, it doesn't say do it, right? So maybe Google's, at least their original mission was something like, organize the world's information, make it universally findable, something like that, right? So very clearly they are going to do it themselves. That's not what we do. We are tool builders. We enable other people to do things. I listened to a podcast interview with Satya Nadella a couple of months ago, and he said something very interesting. He said about Microsoft, he said, basically, when I, Satya, talk to potential new employees, and they ask me, hey, why should I join Microsoft? Why shouldn't I join, I don't know, Facebook or Google or whatever, right? And what Satya then told them is that, hey, it's very simple. Like, if you want to be cool, you should work at these other companies. If you want to enable other people to be cool, you should work at Microsoft. And that's actually very much how I look at Neo4j as well, right? We don't organize the world's information. We don't ourselves make sense of a lot of data, right? But we help other people do it. So that's kind of the help part of it. And then we say, I don't think I need to talk about make sense of data, why that's valuable. I think a lot of people appreciate how important that is in order to have kind of data-driven, facts-driven discussions and decision-making. But then we say the world, and that's ultimately very ambitious, obviously, right? But it really is how I think about it. We don't just want to build tools and technologies for, I don't know, big pharma companies in North America, right? Or financial services companies in London, or hipster startups in South of Market in San Francisco, right? Ultimately, we want to help everyone make sense of data, and that's really, really ambitious. And we try to be smart about it. And you don't go to the market by building something for everyone. That's just not a smart way to do it. So there's a sequencing involved there, right? Currently, as you well know, we're focused on businesses, and in particular on the commercial side, primarily we're focused on big enterprises, right? Because that's just a smart way of starting things out. But 2-3 decades from now, I can definitely see us targeting much more broader than that. Absolutely.
Well, I mean, maybe that's a good segue to talk a little bit about our industry, right?
Yes.
It's been 2 years since we spoke, and man, has that changed a little bit, right?
It has.
It's been quite a journey. But you see, lots of other people starting to talk about graphs. There's every man and their dog has a graph feature these days.
Yes.
Then you see big behemoths like Amazon, with their Neptune offering. You see, other companies offering new technologies. What's your view on the industry these days? How do you look at that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So when we got started, we came up with this kind of crazy notion that you could build a new type of database with a new data model, right? And we weren't the only people that saw that the world was connected, and that like a graph perspective, a connected data perspective was valuable. Like a notable example is the RDF people, right? So RDF, I don't remember any more off the top of my head, but I feel like RDF was probably formalized in like 97 or something like that, right? So a long time ago, even before we got started, right? So there's been a lot of other people who thought of it in that way, but we really moved it into databases, and the kind of our particular angle on connected data was what's now known as the property graph model, right? Which I think is standing the test of time in terms of adoption as a really pragmatic approach, a really developer-friendly approach to model connected data. But back when we invented it, it wasn't clear how we would bring it to market, right? You could imagine, for example, that we could have brought it to the market as something like, hey, we're a database accelerator. We live right next to your real database, also known as the relational database, right? And we make some queries go faster.
Like a cache or something.
Yeah, like a cache or like an index or something like that. That would be a completely viable path to market for the technology we had invented in the early 2000s, right? But we felt that no, this is so important, and it's going to be increasingly important over time, that it deserves its own category, right? So Neo4j is an X, solve for X. What is X, right? You could call it a database. That kind of undersells it because it's qualitatively very different from a relational database. And ultimately, of course, you know the story where what we ended up with was graph database. We tried out a bunch of different things. We tried network-oriented database. We tried net-based, like network plus database. We tried a bunch of different things, and it didn't work. But then when we used the word graph database, it just connected with people. No pun intended, right? It just resonated, right? And when you choose a category creation approach, like initially you're all alone, right? And my most recent example for this is Levi Strauss, right? When they invented a new type of pants called jeans, right? They were the only ones who had jeans, and they couldn't call it pants, but that would have they are different than other pants. Of course, they are pants. They're different than other pants, right? And so initially they were the only provider of jeans, right? Now, of course, fast forward to today, and all the pants companies, whatever that is, they now carry jeans, right? They have their own model of jeans. And that's exactly what we now have seen unfold for us, right? Basically, all the big enterprise software vendors, right, now have graph database offerings, with various level of maturity. And that is a sign of success. As you well know from the inside, I've been saying forever that, hey, you know what, like we're very alone right now, but the only way that we can stay alone is if we're not doing something that is valuable enough, right? Because if it's valuable, then other people will come in and compete against us. And I think what we've seen, what has been pretty mind-blowing to me, it's been 2 years since we did this podcast. That I guess was end of 2016. 2 years preceding that, in 2014, Forrester did this research note on the emerging graph database market. And they were very early at the time at looking at this. And they made this amazing prediction that you've seen me use in slides a gazillion times back in 2014, where they said 3 years from now, in 2017, 25% of the world's enterprises will be using a graph database. And I remember back in 2014, when I saw that, I was like, that's awesome. Yeah. And to myself, I'm like, those guys are crazy. It can never go that fast. And then, of course, a year ago, when I was on stage at Graph Connect, our annual conference in New York, as I was prepping for that, it was very timely because Forrester then released an updated report where they interviewed over 2,200 enterprises and asked about all kinds of questions about, are you using graph database? Do you plan on using graph database? And so on and so forth. And the result that came back was that over 50%, I think the exact number was 51% of the enterprises, the over 2,200 enterprises that they surveyed, were actually using a graph database.
Which is way more.
Even more than what I thought was kind of a crazy thing. And I'm, of course, kind of the relentless optimist about graph database adoption, right? And so when you look at something like that, then you realize that, of course, Oracle is going to enter the market. Of course, Microsoft is going to enter the market. Of course, Amazon is going to enter the market. And as kind of the early defining the I think objectively, of course, I'm extremely biased here, but objectively, we're the leader today. If you look at any kind of external metrics, that's both a scary and an amazing thing, right? It is scary because it's competition. It is from some of the biggest companies on the planet: Amazon, Oracle, Microsoft, right? But by and large, it's much more of a positive than a negative thing, because I think I 100% still believe that the biggest competition that we have is unawareness. It's people that have a problem because of connected data, but they don't think of it in that way. They think my database is slow, or my fraud, detection application doesn't detect enough fraud, or my recommendations are too bad, or something like that. I mean, so they think of the symptoms, but the actual root cause is that they have connected data trapped in a form that is not good for it. For example, a relational database, and they can't operate on it, right? And more people that can preach that and get the word out of that is massively net positive for us.
Couldn't agree more. Well, I mean, and that kind of begs the question, how is Neo4j as a company doing, right? I mean, we had this fantastic announcement in, I think, 1st of November, was it, when we closed another funding round, EU round, which obviously, for us internally, it's always a great validation. We're happy about it. It enables a bunch of things, but as a company, at the end of the day, someday we'll have to make money, and we'll have to make sure that our shareholders get their fair reward.
Yes, because both of us are shareholders. Yeah.
Very, very correct. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. But I just want to, get your perspective on how is the company doing from your perspective? I mean, it's 250 people these days, all continents, spread all over, big engineering group, big sales group. Yeah. How is the company doing from your perspective?
I think we're in a really healthy spot right now. I think that one of the things that we talked about back in 2016, I remember, was we had just raised funding back then. Is that your algorithm, by the way? You're only willing to speak to me on the podcast to raise money? Because that means it may not be another podcast episode.
Well, it's the IPO, right? IPO, that's what we're
talking about. IPO, then I'm worthy to be invited back. No, but one of the things that I remember us talking about back in 2016 is that we've always approached it a little bit differently, right? And being a Silicon Valley company, but with European roots, if you look around in the Valley, like one of the things that you see is that there's a very tried, true, and proven model for how to build these companies. And it's basically, you raise a crap load of money, and that's a technical term, by the way, a crap load of money. And then you build a product and you open source it if it's an infrastructure kind of developer facing product, or you already open source it and you raise money on the back of that. And then you build up a small organization, you get it out there in as many hands as possible. Like you talk about maybe eyeballs, you talk about download numbers, adoption numbers, and things like that. On the back of that, you raise even more money. And then maybe you start selling a little bit, and then you sell the company. And that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek because there's a lot of great companies. There's a new generation of open source companies that I admire. There's some more recently public ones like MuleSoft, like Elastic, like Mongo, that I think are really high quality companies. There's like a crop of private companies as well, like Confluent, the Kafka company, for example, and that are building it in a different way. But by and large, that's a little bit the Valley model. And I've never subscribed to that. I've always felt that, yes, of course, it's infrastructure software. And when you go up against huge competitors, Amazon has a massive balance sheet. Oracle has a massive balance sheet, right? Then it really helps in order to have investor funding. But by and large, I want to run this in a customer-funded fashion, right? I want to grow alongside our customers because that's just a much more healthy way of building a business. And I'm trying to kind of do this mix of a more, let's call it a more kind of European way of running it versus a more Silicon Valley way of running it. And I don't want to be exclusive in either bucket. I think there's a happy middle path in there. And I think so far I've been extremely happy with how we've executed on that.
Well, I would agree, right? I mean, I remember actually not long after we did our last podcast, there was this blip in the stock market in Silicon Valley, early 2017, right? And internally, we went through this phase where we actually returned to cash flow positive really quickly, right? It was a really great example of how you could actually control your own destiny much safer that way.
And I think that is just a really important constraint for me. That's how I look at it. Like, no matter how much money we raised, and obviously the series, like $80 million, that's a lot of money, right? Yeah. But no matter how much money we raise, I always want to make sure that we can get to cash flow positive without drastic things like, hey, let's riff, which is in American riff is like reduction in force, right? So
I don't.
Let's lay off a third of the company. Then of course you can get to cash flow positive. But no, I want to be able to get to cash flow positive and control our own destiny without anything drastic like that. And I'm the last guy you should talk about when it comes to predicting the stock market. I am consistently wrong about that. But I do feel, look, we're at a 10-year all-time high, type thing. And, as we're recording this in December of 2018, the past month or so, you've seen a lot of fluctuation on the stock market. In the next few years, again, I've been consistently wrong when I've been predicting stuff like that. I still think that there's going to be something pretty dramatic. There's going to be some big correction. And then being able to meter your investment and come back to cash flow positive if you need to, is just a really fundamentally healthy thing.
I agree. I have two more things that I wanted to chat to you about. This other guy, David Beryl, he was suggesting that we talk a little bit about how decisions are made inside a company, and it's a really fascinating one because internally, then you've been advocate about this whole idea of trying to get to consensus without gridlock, without deadlocking, and making sure that we get things done, but at the same time respect each other in getting to those decisions. And recently, I mean, the past 12 months, we've done some massive changes to our leadership team, right? And people that make decisions like Lance Walter or Mike Asher or Denise Persson now, on the board. Those are like really important people because they will influence decisions in a major way, right?
Yes.
So I was wondering how you look at decision making, but also the changes that you've made to the management team, to the board. Interesting topic, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this is obviously a topic that we could do 5 podcasts just
absolutely
on this one, because I spend a lot of time thinking about this and I have pretty strong opinions about it. But I mean, I think in a nutshell, there's always this balance, I think, in an organization between like a more authoritative way of running the company versus a more consensus way of running the company. And I think there's no doubt that at both of the extremes are really bad. I think most people would agree with that. However, reasonable people can disagree on kind of in the very broad mid-range of that spectrum where you should be. And in that broad mid-range of the spectrum, I gravitate much more towards consensus. And consensus is a funny thing, right? Because as you know, I'm a freaky mix of European and American, right? In that I've lived 8-9 years of my life in the US, but I was born in Europe, and what I've learned in America, in American business culture, like consensus is seen as a very, very bad thing. And what it took me a while to understand was that what people perceived as consensus was waiting for everyone to agree before you execute. And that's horrible. Like if that is your management style, that's a really, really inefficient. I mean, Darwin will make sure that those companies don't so that you don't survive for long if that's how you operate. But having said so, I call that bad consensus. And what I call good consensus, however, is when you have a very clear decision-making process that for every single decision, it's very clear who owns that decision, who is accountable for that particular decision. And when the people then execute along that, let's say there's a project with 3-4 people who are going to do something, right? And maybe it is an internal systems cleanup. Maybe we're migrating to a new CRM, or maybe it's a customer project. Maybe it is some like a product roadmap project or something like that. If you have a tight small group that is going to execute on that, as long as you hire smart people who are really committed, it's way more efficient. They will execute much, much better if they are aligned with that direction. If you get them to buy into that direction. That is always what I optimize for. I want those people to agree. Now, if you're looking at 200 people, you can't get 200 people to agree. But anyway, 200 people aren't working on a singular task anyway, right? But if you have that small group of people, and you can get them all to agree that this is the direction that we're going, they will just execute better. And why? Because ultimately, I think one of the strongest powers in the universe is intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation. When you do something not because we dangle dollars or euros, before you, but you do something, you want to go to a place because you intrinsically believe it's important to go there. Right?
You want to go there. Yep.
Exactly, right. And part of unlocking that is getting people to agree that that's the best way to go. Now, it's really important to pair that up, and this is to your point about bad consensus, which has these deadlock problems, right? This actually has all kinds of symmetry with distributed transactions and things like that, which let's not get into that. No. But you need to avoid that. So you need to couple that with disagree and then commit. And disagree and then commit is the fact that for every one of these decisions, I mentioned that before, it has to be clear who actually owns that decision. And it's up to them to say, all right, hey guys, we've debated enough. Like, we're not going to get to agreement here. Now let's disagree and then commit. And then we need to have a really strong culture of actually, when the person who is in charge of making that particular decision is pointing in that direction, now it's not a democracy, where I'm going to disagree, but I'm still going to commit to that direction. And so that's one of the most important tenets for how I want to run the company. So I think that was 1A of your question.
Yes.
In terms of 1B, yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of changes. I think since early 17, like half of the management team has changed in some way, shape, or form. Avad Zakaria joined as our first corp dev biz dev leader in, I guess, summer of 17. You mentioned Lance Walter, who joined as our new CMO, I think Jan of this year. So about a year ago. Mike Asher joined us, our first CFO this summer. We've done a lot of changes on the board in conjunction with this funding round. Also added a new independent, Denise Person, who's the CMO of Snowflake. So there's been a lot of changes in the past 12 to 18 months. And the way that I look at that is just as a very natural part of the growing up process, right? If you now look between the board and the management team, you have a lot of people with experience taking companies public, but also selling companies to bigger companies, right? And as you and I have talked about many times, and as I talk about in onboarding and in actually also in interviews with candidates, is that obviously we've raised money, and we talked about kind of fiduciary duty to shareholders before. I mean, that's one of the most important jobs of the CEO, and I do take that really, really seriously. This is people, like a lot of real money that have gone into the company, like pension fund money and things like that. I mean, that's not nothing. And I think it's really important that we return that capital, right, and give them really good returns. Having said that, in my day-to-day, I don't think about that. I don't think about IPO. I don't think about selling the company. I think about building a really high-quality, good company, building a product that people love, solving real problems for real customers who are willing to part with some of their lovely dollars because it's so valuable that we solve those problems, right? If you do that and you focus on that, all else will follow.
Such a beautiful note.
You said you had two things.
Maybe we should end it here. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We could have ended there, but I have one more thing I wanted to ask you. It's about the future. It's about plans for both the company, but also the products and what's driving our success in the market, really, right? What's your take on that? What's your crystal ball say?
Wow, that's a broad question.
Well, I'm curious where you'll take it.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot to say. That's another 4 or 5 podcasts if we so choose. Well, I guess let me choose one particular angle on it. I think that. Let me add 2 things together that we talked about in the podcast so far. One is that Forrester prediction, the 25% that they predicted back in 2014 that ended up being more than 50%. And then let's take the recent round of funding that we did. So if you look today, over 75 of the Fortune 100 are now using Neo4j. 20 of the 25 biggest banks in the world are now using Neo4j. 7 of the 10 biggest retailers, 4 of the 5 biggest telcos. These are some pretty amazing numbers, right?
Of course, yeah.
And it speaks a lot. It says a lot about the value of using connected data, right? And the way that I think about that is that I now look at the past 10, 15 years of my life, and I see 2 broad waves of graph adoption. And what I start seeing right now is this early embryonic phase of a third massive wave of graph adoption. And the first wave was very clearly what happened in the early 2000s in the consumer web, right? This is the stuff that we've talked about so many times where, you know, Google came into the web search market and they said, hey, we're going to do everything identical to how Yahoo and AltaVista and Excite and Lycos and all these other search companies, how they do it. We're going to download all the web pages in the world. And when you search for Rik Van Bruggen, I'm going to look inside of every one of these documents. But on top of that, we're also going to extract how they're connected. And we're going to rank the search results based on that. And that's PageRank, right? That one innovation unlocked the most valuable company of that era, right? Google, right? And the same is, of course, true for LinkedIn, which if you compare it to the other professional I guess, recruiting sites, Dice.com, Monster.com, and so on and so forth. The one innovation that LinkedIn had was that not only did they store the profiles and the jobs that were available, but they stored how people were connected to each other, the professional network. And we can go on there's so many examples of this. If you just add up some of the most obvious examples of companies that have gone into the respective market and reshaped it around connected data, use connected data to build much better products, that's over $1 trillion worth of market cap. Over $1 trillion worth of market cap. That's pretty amazing. I see that as the first wave of graph adoption. The second wave of graph adoption is what we are surfing right now. That's the 76 of the Fortune 100. That's exactly the same thing that happened in the consumer web, but in the enterprise, right? And that's the enterprise taking their existing standard use cases, things like fraud detection, which existed before connected data. It just used isolated data. And then they start building much better fraud detection with this, which exerts competitive pressure on the banks that aren't using connected data for fraud detection, because the ones that do capture more fraud, right? And that means something in the market. And the same with recommendations, right? There were recommendations before people used connected data. But now with connected data, they can do better recommendations, which would drive more top line for the retailers, which will exert competitive pressure on them. So that's the second wave of graph adoption. What I see right now is what I believe is the third wave of graph adoption is what's going on in AI and machine learning. And one of the most exciting research paper that was published, I think, this year in that world was the really like an amazing group of blue chip AI researchers. These are the Google DeepMind people. It's a bunch of people from MIT, and there's just this absolute top tier AI researcher authored paper, which basically says, in order to take the next step in deep learning and machine learning, we have to look at graphs. And of course, one of the key things that we see emerging right now, and you see it out in the field, right? And I see it, I talked about it at Graph Connect, is people using connected data to provide better predictive capabilities for AI and machine learning. I think that is as big of a wave as what's been going on for 5 years now inside of the enterprise, when the enterprise is taking their standard applications, not new applications, standard applications, and power them with connected data. Right now, we're starting to see the first innings, if you want to use a sports metaphor, a baseball sports metaphor, which I'm as clueless as you are probably, yes, fellow European. Yeah. We're the first inning of that happening in AI. And that, I think, is going to be just this massive wave for anyone in the broader graph technology landscape over the next 10 plus years to come.
We've seen some fantastic examples of that already, right? With customers and users alike. It's been really great. Well, that's a really positive note to end on.
I thought so.
I think so too. Thank you so much for joining me, Emil. It's been a pleasure talking to you again. And again, we're going to end with one last promise, right?
Yes, let's not make it. Last time we said let's not make it 18 months, and then we made it 24 months.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know. How are we going to live up to this now? I think we've lost our credibility here.
Damn it. But at the latest, after the IPO, right?
At the latest after the IPO. Okay,
we'll talk before.
At least now we're sandbagging the numbers, so for sure we're going to be able to deliver on this one.